Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. So, today's story takes us back to 2018, in a small town called Haslingden in Lancashire that's in the northwest of England. That's where an 18-year-old named Tiernan Darton lived. He was born on the 19th of September, 2000, and raised there by his mom and his stepdad. Tiernan's biological father hadn't really been in the picture at all. In fact, he'd been gone for so long that Tiernan didn't have any real memories of him. The man he grew up calling Dad was Chris, his stepfather. Chris had been in his life from when he was just a little boy. He was the one who raised him, supported him, and shaped his sense of what a father figure was. And it wasn't just Chris. Tiernan also became close with Chris's family. Chris's mother, Mary, was like a real grandmother to him. They didn't pretend to be blood relatives. They still called each other step this and step that, but it didn't matter. What they had felt genuine. They were a family. But Tiernan's life didn't unfold as smoothly as everyone had hoped. When he was around 12 years old, things began to shift. He started to show signs of struggling with his mental health. At first, it looked like social anxiety, small things like discomfort in conversations or trouble talking to strangers. But those small things gradually became bigger. He withdrew more and more. It wasn't just that he didn't like talking to people, he found it exhausting, overwhelming. Even talking to a cashier became a source of panic. As his anxiety worsened, his life began shrinking. He stopped seeing his friends, stopped doing the things he loved. Eventually, even going to school became too much. And because school attendance is mandatory in the UK, his family had to find a way to keep him in education. That's how Tiernan ended up being homeschooled. Now here's the thing, homeschooling in the UK isn't common at all. It's not like in some other countries where parents might choose that freely. In the UK, it's typically reserved for really exceptional circumstances. And for Tiernan, this was considered a last resort. Honestly, I think being isolated at home while also dealing with anxiety and depression is one of the worst combinations. It's like everything that could have helped him seeing people, being part of something, having structure was taken away. And instead, he was stuck in this loop, too anxious to go out and growing more depressed from being inside all the time. Eventually, it got bad enough that Tiernan was referred to CAMS, the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, under the NHS. It's supposed to be a safety net for young people who are really struggling. But, well, here's where things often fall apart. I've seen and read so many experiences and had my own, to be honest, where CAMH ends up doing more harm than good. There are definitely some good therapists in the system, I'm sure of that. But a lot of the time, young people leave those sessions feeling misunderstood, dismissed, or even worse than before they went in. People who've attempted suicide being told they're just sensitive. It's heartbreaking, and Tiernan ended up being part of that system. So we can probably imagine that CAMHS didn't do all that much for Tiernan Darton. And as the years went by, it became clear that he wasn't really making progress. He was still in the house, day in and day out, anxious, depressed, stuck. It was like time was moving for everyone else, but not for him. I think that alone says a lot about how ineffective his therapy must have been. Nothing really changed. But eventually, after a few years of this, Tiernan started to feel something shift inside him. He began thinking about his future, about what his life might look like if he kept going like this. And for the first time in a while, he found the courage to try and do something about it. He realized that while other people his age were finishing school and heading off to college with their GCSEs in hand, he was falling behind. They had qualifications, they had plans, he didn't want to stay in that place forever. Around the age of 16, Tiernan decided it was time to try and re-enter the education system. He wanted to catch up, or at least not fall even further behind. The only issue was he hadn't taken his GCSEs. And without them, most traditional colleges were off limits. But in the UK, there's an option for people in his situation. It's called a further education college, designed for those who didn't get the standard qualifications, but still want to pick up skills or do courses that might help them get a job. It's not academic like A-levels or university prep. It's more practical for employability, for getting something on your CV. So Tiernan enrolled at Kendall College, a further education college. And for a moment, it looked like he was taking a step in the right direction. But that didn't last. Not long after starting, he dropped out. At first, I assumed it was his anxiety acting up again, that maybe he couldn't cope with the pressures of being around people or being in a classroom setting. But it turns out that wasn't the case. He didn't drop out completely, he just transferred. He left Kendall College and joined Lancaster and Morecambe College instead, which is another similar kind of institution. But again, the same thing happened. He wasn't there long before he dropped out once more. At that point, it became hard to tell what was really going on. There's not much clear information about this part of Tiernan's life. But what we do know is he was still battling the same demons. The anxiety, the depression, the sense of being lost and out of place in the world. And that hadn't changed. By this point, Tiernan was about 17 years old, and things were starting to take a darker turn. He wasn't just struggling internally anymore now, he was acting out, becoming difficult, misbehaving, getting into arguments. From what I could piece together, things at home got so tense that either he left the house on his own or his mom kicked him out. It's not super clear which one happened first, but what is clear is that they reached a point where they just couldn't live under the same roof anymore. So here he was, 17 years old, no place to go, out on his own. But he wasn't completely alone. His step-grandmother, a 94-year-old woman named Mary Gregory, stepped in and offered him a place to stay. Mary was the mother of Tiernan's stepfather, Chris. She lived nearby and she didn't hesitate. She took him in without question. She even had a spare key cut for him. And I think for Tiernan, this was a big deal. At Mary's place, he wasn't treated like a kid. He wasn't being scolded or managed. He was treated like an adult, like a roommate. There were expectations, of course, but it wasn't strict. And he loved that. After years of feeling like he didn't belong anywhere, Mary's house became his safe space. Eventually, he even patched things up with his mom, at least to a degree. He didn't fully move back in with her, but he started spending time at both houses. It was kind of like he had two homes now, and he could just choose where he wanted to sleep on any given night. But this peace, this temporary stability, didn't last. Just 1 year later, when Tiernan was 18 years old, Mary Gregory passed away. And her death wasn't just a tragedy because of her age or their bond. It was far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. So let me tell you what happened to Mary. It was the early hours of May 28th, 2018, and the quiet street of Levens Drive was suddenly shattered by the sound of screaming. Not just any screams, these were loud, frantic, blood-curdling, the kind that make your heart drop before you even know why. People shot out of their beds, rushing to their windows in confusion and panic. And that's when they saw it. One of the houses on the street was completely engulfed in flames, thick smoke rising into the night sky, glowing orange behind shattered glass. It was Mary Gregory's house. Her neighbors knew her well. She was 94 years old, lived mostly alone, and there was no way she could get herself out of that fire. They didn't even hesitate. Calls were made to the fire brigade within seconds. Everyone feared the worst because they all knew Mary was still inside. When firefighters arrived, they wasted no time. They kicked the front door down and pushed through the smoke. And just as they stepped inside, they found her. Mary was lying unconscious in the conservatory, right beneath a table. It looked like she had been trying to escape. She was just feet away from the door. So close. It seemed like maybe she tried to crawl under the table, or maybe she got disoriented in the thick black smoke. Whatever happened, she didn't make it out in time. The fumes had overwhelmed her before she could reach safety. The moment the firefighters saw her, they knew this was critical. This wasn't just a rescue, this was life or death. They pulled her out as fast as they could and got her to the hospital. For the next 3 days, Mary was kept alive by machines. Tubes, monitors, nurses watching every breath. But despite all their efforts, she didn't improve. And on the 1st of June, 2018, 3 days after the fire, Mary Gregory's heart gave out. She was gone. She was 94 years old. After the fire, investigators were brought in to figure out what had happened inside Mary Gregory's home. They needed to determine how the blaze had even started and whether it was truly just a tragic accident. Their conclusion? They believed the fire was most likely caused by Mary herself. Mary was a heavy smoker. And on top of that, she had dementia, which meant she sometimes lit cigarettes and forgot she lit them, or she wouldn't put them out properly afterward. Investigators thought it was entirely possible that one of those forgotten cigarettes might have been what ignited the fire that took her life. To them, it seemed like a sad, avoidable accident. And Mary's family was devastated. Her death had been so sudden, so violent, and so final. But in some strange way, the tragedy brought the family back together, at least for a while. Tiernan moved back in with his mom and stepdad full-time. Things weren't perfect. There were still arguments, still tension, but they made it work. Or at least, they tried to. But while the family might have seemed to settle, Tiernan himself wasn't okay. His mental health kept spiraling, day by day, year by year. He wasn't getting the right kind of help, and being stuck in the house all the time only made things worse. By the time he was around 20 years old, Tiernan was officially transferred out of CAMS and into adult mental health services. That meant a new team, a new system, and a new therapist. And in one particular session with that new therapist, Tiernan said something that caught them completely off guard. He told the therapist that one of his friends could send him to prison with what they knew about him. Naturally, the therapist asked him to explain. What did he mean by that? Why would his friend have information that could land him in jail? And that's when Tiernan began telling a story. It was about a party he'd gone to the year before, back in 2019. A pretty typical gathering for teenagers. Drinks, noise, and eventually, a game of truth or dare. When it was Tiernan's turn, he picked the truth, and someone asked him a question. So during this game of truth or dare, one of Tiernan's friends looked him straight in the eye and asked him, "What's your darkest secret?" Tiernan paused for a moment. Then, in front of the entire group, he said that his darkest secret, something no one else knew about him, was that he had killed someone. The room went quiet, everyone froze for a second. But then someone broke the silence and said what they were all thinking. "Nah, I don't believe you." They thought he was joking, making it up, trying to be edgy or dark for attention. But Tiernan didn't laugh it off. Instead, he doubled down. He insisted it was true. And he told them that if they didn't believe him, he'd prove it by telling them the whole story from beginning to end. Now, we'll come back to what exactly he said at that party in just a moment. Because when he was sitting in that therapy room months later, talking to his new counselor, he started recounting this same story. The story of that party and the confession he made that night, but he didn't say it clearly, not at all. Instead, he spoke in riddles, vague phrases, cryptic sentences that left his therapist totally confused. He danced around the truth, as if he wasn't sure whether to say it out loud or keep it buried. Honestly, I think the therapist did what most people would have done in that moment. He stopped Tiernan mid-sentence and said, "I'm not really clear what you're saying, but I think you're telling me you've killed someone." Tiernan didn't say a word in response. He just turned his head and mouthed the word yes. Now, just take a second to imagine being in that therapist's seat. You're sitting across from a 20-year-old client who's clearly fragile, clearly not well, and he's just told you he's killed someone. Not only that, he told you he's already told other people about it at a party, in detail. So what do? Do you call the police? Do you tell his parents? Do you alert social services? You think so, right? But no, the therapist didn't do anything. And honestly, I don't know how to make sense of that, because I cannot imagine any trained professional hearing something like that from someone showing obvious signs of psychological distress and just sitting on it. No report, no action, nothing. Tiernan went home that day like nothing had happened. And for the next week or two, life continued as if that therapy session never took place. But then came the next session. And this time, Tiernan didn't come alone. He brought his stepfather, Chris. And I think that was intentional because during this session, Tiernan was ready. He was about to go deeper. He was ready to tell both his therapist and his stepfather exactly what he had done. Tiernan Darnton sat there in that therapy room beside his stepfather and finally said the words that had been building up for a year. He told them that the fire which killed his grandmother, Mary, the one everyone thought was a tragic accident, wasn't an accident at all, because he was the one who started it. He said it hadn't come out of nowhere, either. In the months leading up to her death, his feelings toward Mary had shifted from frustration to resentment and then to hatred. They'd been arguing more and more. Mary was old-fashioned, proud of her home, and particular about how things should be. And Tiernan was the opposite. He'd leave his things everywhere, invite his friends over without asking, break things, eat all the food, treat the place like it wasn't even hers. Honestly, I think it's not hard to imagine why Mary would be upset. She was 94. She lived a long, careful life. Her house was her sanctuary. And now it was being turned into a mess by someone she'd opened her doors to. She tried to stand her ground, but every time she did, it just seemed to make Tiernan angrier. He didn't see her rules as boundaries, he saw them as challenges. And the tension just kept growing. Then came the final straw, their last argument. It happened on the very day of the fire. And according to Tiernan, that argument was the worst one yet. Mary told him, right to his face, that she despised him, that his presence in her home disgusted her, that he was nothing but a burden. And that flipped a switch in Tiernan's mind. That was the moment. That was when he decided he'd had enough of Mary Gregory. And he had a plan. He knew exactly how he was going to get her out of his life. In the early hours of May 28th, 2018, Tiernan, who was just 17 at the time, quietly left his mother's house and walked through the night toward his grandmother Mary's home. He had a key. He still had access. So he let himself in and began putting his plan in motion. Upstairs, Mary was fast asleep. She never stirred, not once, while all of this was happening. She had no idea that her grandson had just entered the house and that he wasn't there to visit. Tiernan took his time. He didn't want to risk her escaping. He wanted to make sure that once the fire started, there'd be no way out. So first, he dismantled the smoke alarms both upstairs and downstairs. Without them, no one would be alerted. No one would hear a thing. Then, he disconnected the landline. Mary wouldn't be able to call for help. No way to reach the fire brigade. No way to scream down the line for someone to save her. And finally, he dragged a heavy table in front of the conservatory door, blocking her one clear exit. The very door she would later be found just inches away from, unconscious, lying beneath that table. That table was the final barrier between life and death. With everything set, Tiernan was ready to start the fire. There are different reports about where exactly he lit it, but most sources say it was in the living room downstairs, not far from where the curtains hung. He lit a cigarette, then casually dropped it onto the fabric, and stood there, watching. He stood there and watched the flames grow first, the curtains, then the furniture, then the walls. And when he was sure the fire had taken hold, Tiernan left. He stepped out of the house, locked the door behind him, trapping his 94-year-old grandmother inside. Then he walked home, went to bed, as if nothing had happened. Later, he admitted that during Mary's funeral, he felt powerful, sitting among grieving relatives, knowing something that none of them did, knowing the truth. He knew why she really died. And that's how Tiernan Darnton murdered his own grandmother and got away with it for years. So yeah, that party back in 2019, that was the first time Tiernan ever told anyone what he had done. It happened during a game of truth or dare, surrounded by a bunch of other teenagers who, at the time, thought it was all some kind of dark, twisted joke. But Tiernan wasn't joking. He looked them in the eyes and said he was serious, that what he was telling them really happened. And when they started pressing him for answers, asking why would he kill his own grandmother, Tiernan didn't hesitate. He had a reason ready. He said it was because Mary had been suffering from dementia and he didn't want her to suffer anymore. He framed it as a mercy killing, like he'd done her a favor. And for a moment, the room went quiet. No one laughed. They still didn't really believe him, not fully, but the mood shifted. What they once thought was a strange, edgy joke was starting to feel serious and uncomfortable. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smiling. He was completely matter of fact, calm. I think that made it even worse. Still, none of those kids said anything. They left that party and went back to their normal lives. They didn't tell their parents. They didn't tell the police. Maybe they told a couple of other kids, but even if they did, the silence stayed intact. And Tiernan, he kept living like nothing happened. Until now. Because finally, Tiernan told two people who weren't gonna let him walk away this time. His therapist and his stepfather, Chris. And honestly, I think that says a lot about who Tiernan really was, that he chose that moment with that audience to confess. He waited until his stepfather, the son of the woman he killed, was sitting in the room just so he could tell him to his face. That's cold. The therapist didn't waste any time. He contacted the police immediately, and that same evening, officers arrived at Tiernan Darnton's home and arrested him. They brought him in for questioning, while a separate team began searching his house looking for anything that might be useful. They seized his electronics, computers, phones, hard drives, hoping to uncover more of what he'd been up to. They wanted to know what he'd been searching, who he'd been talking to, what else he might have been planning. And when they opened up his search history, well, it told them a lot. In June of 2018, less than a month after Mary Gregory's death, Tiernan Darnton was already making internet searches that raised every possible red flag. He was Googling things like, murderer filled with despair, I want to cause evil, urge to kill again, and most disturbing of all, I think I'm turning into a serial killer, please help. So when police later confronted him with this during questioning, they asked the obvious, if you're not a murderer, then why are you searching things like this? And Tiernan's response? He said it was just because he had a deep interest in true crime. Honestly, I think we all know what a true crime interest looks like, and it's not that. My search history doesn't look like that. Yours probably doesn't either. Especially not, I think I'm turning into a serial killer, please help. That's not research, that's a cry or a confession, but that wasn't all police found on his devices. They also uncovered typed documents where Tiernan had written out violent fantasies, things about stalking women, attacking them, even keeping lists what looked like a kill list filled with names. There were a lot of names, and with that, paired alongside his search history, police knew they had stopped something potentially even worse from happening. One of the key pieces of evidence that helped tie Tiernan directly to the scene of the fire was surprisingly simple but powerful. On the night of the fire, right before heading to Mary's house, Tiernan stopped at a petrol station. CCTV captured him picking up a few things, a pack of Tunnix tea cakes and a can of Coke. And when investigators went back to look through the crime scene photos from Mary Gregory's house, there they were. That same pack of tea cakes, that same can of Coke, sitting inside the burned remains of her home. It placed him at the scene, at the time of the fire, just as he described. And with that, Tiernan Darnton was officially charged with the murder of his own grandmother. His trial was set to begin in November of 2021, so not that long ago really. And when it came time for his defense team to argue his case, they took a very specific approach. Tiernan denied everything. He said he hadn't killed his grandmother, that it was all just a terrible accident, a tragic house fire. He claimed that both of his confessions at the party and in therapy were simply misunderstood. He said he was just trying to get attention, that he made it all up to impress people. He even said that the kids at that party, the ones he confessed to during Truth or Dare, were the edgy kids, the ones he wanted to fit in with. So he invented a dark, twisted story to make himself seem more interesting. But according to him, none of it was real. But realistically, no matter how much Tiernan Darnton tried to deny it, no matter how many excuses he gave or how many lies he told, everyone could see right through him. Everyone knew he was responsible for the murder of Mary Gregory. And more than that, everyone could see just how cold, how calculated, and how deliberate his actions really were. He didn't just set a fire. He dismantled the smoke alarms. He disconnected the telephone. He dragged a table in front of the only door she could have used to escape. These weren't spontaneous choices. They were planned, one by one, carefully thought out. He didn't want Mary to survive that night. He sat at home, thought it through, and then he carried it out. And what was it all over? An argument. A 94-year-old woman asked for a little respect in her own home, and that was enough for him to decide she didn't deserve to live anymore. It's terrifying when you really think about it. Before the trial officially began, psychiatrists were brought in to assess Tiernan's mental state to see if there was anything deeper going on that could explain why he did what he did. One of the psychiatrists mentioned that he suspected Tiernan might be on the autism spectrum, though it was never confirmed, never diagnosed, never even formally explored. It was more of a note than anything else, possibly to help guide further assessments later on. But the real focus of the psychiatric evaluations was Tiernan's mental health, his depression, his anxiety, and whether any of that could have been a driving factor in what he did. And the answer was clear. Yes, Tiernan had severe depression and anxiety. That much was undeniable. But those things, as real and painful as they can be, weren't the reason Mary Gregory died. This murder wasn't about mental illness. It was about him. Tiernan Darnton made a choice. He let his anger win. And he planned the death of the one person who had opened her doors to him when he had nowhere else to go. A 94-year-old woman who gave him a bed so he wouldn't be sleeping on the street. And this was how he repaid her. In court, the psychiatrist made it clear. He believed that Tiernan Darnton was fully responsible for what he did. There was no influence of mental illness, no psychotic break, no excuse. Tiernan knew exactly what he was doing that night, and he carried it out with intention. At the end of the trial, the jury agreed. Tiernan Darnton was found guilty of the murder of Mary Gregory. He was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 15 years before he could even be considered for parole. He was 21 years old at the time of sentencing, and that's where he is now, behind bars. The police had no doubt about the decision, especially after what they'd found on his laptop. Because the scariest part of all this is thinking about what might have happened if he hadn't said anything. If he hadn't bragged about it at that party, if he hadn't slipped during therapy, who knows how far he might have gone? Who knows what name we'd be hearing next?